Today, we're going to dive into a fascinating scientific paper that reads almost like a detective story about our nation's rivers. It's a story about a massive effort, some really puzzling results, and two powerful forces that are basically in a tug-of-war for the future of our water. So get this. Since the Clean Water Act was passed way back in 1972, it's estimated that the U.S. has spent over $1 trillion on improving water quality. I mean, that is a massive investment by any measure. And yet, here we are with the trillion-dollar puzzle. You'd think with that kind of money and effort, the problem would be solved, right? But in a lot of rivers, the nitrogen pollution has just stuck around. In some cases, it's even gotten worse. So a group of scientists decided to figure out why, digging into data from 478 different watersheds all across the country. Okay, let's really get into this mystery. For decades, the goal has seemed pretty simple, right? We just have to reduce the amount of nitrogen getting into our water from things like farm fertilizer or city wastewater. You reduce the inputs, the rivers should get cleaner. Simple cause and effect. And the stakes here are incredibly high. All this extra nitrogen doesn't just stay in the river. It flows downstream and creates these enormous dead zones in coastal waters. The Gulf of Mexico is a famous example. It's devastating for the ecosystems and for the fishing industry. But here's the kicker, and it's what the researchers point out right away. The results from all our cleanup efforts have been completely all over the map. Some places have seen these fantastic improvements, while others seem totally stuck in the mud. And figuring out why? Well, that's the whole point of their investigation. So the first thing these scientists did was challenge something we all kind of took for granted, the idea that if you cut pollution, the nitrogen levels in the river should drop in a nice, predictable, straight line. But what they found is that the real world is, well, it's a lot messier. The relationship often shows something called a hysteresis effect. Now, that's a bit of a technical term, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It just means the path to recovery isn't the reverse of the path to pollution. The way down is totally different from the way up. The first, and actually the most common pattern they found, is this really frustrating delay. You can be doing all the right things, cutting nitrogen inputs, but the pollution in the river can actually keep going up for years before it even thinks about turning around. They call this a lagging response. But here's the good news. It's not all doom and gloom. They also found a second pattern, an accelerated response. And in these watersheds, the water quality gets better much, much faster than you'd expect based on the reduction in nitrogen. It's like finding a secret shortcut to a cleaner river. And then, of course, you have the ones that actually play by the rules. Some watersheds do follow that simple, predictable, straight-line path where the cleanup is directly tied to cutting pollution, just like the textbook says it should. Now, check out this breakdown, because this is what's so wild. Of all the hundreds of watersheds they looked at where nitrogen inputs had gone down, only about 13%, a tiny fraction, behaved in that simple, linear way we all assumed was normal. A full third of them were lagging behind, and almost a quarter were on that accelerated path. This just proves that the straight-line assumption is the exception, not the rule. Okay, so what's behind these completely different outcomes? Well, it boils down to two very different forces. That slow, lagging response is driven by something called legacy nitrogen, which you see a lot in agricultural areas. But the fast, accelerated response, that's driven by targeted point source controls, often in more urban areas. So let's break those two ideas down. Let's start with that slow, frustrating, lagging response. The researchers have this fantastic term for it. They call it the watershed's memory, and that's a perfect way to think about it. So this is kind of the pessimistic side of the story. For decades and decades, we've been loading up the landscape with nitrogen. It doesn't all just wash away. A lot of it gets stored deep in the soil and the groundwater. It's like a giant sponge that's been soaking up pollution since the 70s and 80s, and even when we stop squeezing more in, that sponge just keeps slowly leaking it out. And if you want a perfect, kind of mind-blowing example of this, just look at the Wisconsin River. The amount of nitrogen going into that watershed actually peaked way back in 1988. But the amount of nitrogen in the river itself, it kept on rising for the next 30 years. That is a 30-year time lag. A really powerful and honestly frustrating example of the land's long memory. But what about that other, more hopeful pattern, that accelerated cleanup? Well, this is where targeted effective management basically creates a shortcut and finds a way to overpower that long-term memory. These success stories, they tend to have a few things in common. They're often in smaller, more populated watersheds, a lot of them on the East Coast. And the key driver is getting a handle on point sources, a specific identifiable source of pollution, like a single pipe coming out of a wastewater treatment plant. The South Fork of the Shenandoah River is just a fantastic case study. Engineers went in and upgraded the wastewater treatment plants, and that alone slashed the nitrogen being piped into the river by a massive 76%. And get this, it led to a 20% drop in river pollution, even while other nitrogen inputs from the surrounding landscape were actually going up. That is management working right there. So you have these two forces pushing and pulling on our rivers. The land's slow, stubborn memory versus this fast-acting, targeted management. And figuring out which one of those forces is in the driver's seat for any given watershed, that's the key to actually getting results. And to really prove their theory, the researchers basically built a digital river in a computer. It allowed them to play with these forces like they were dials on a machine. When they cranked up the time it takes for groundwater to travel, simulating that legacy memory effect, boom, they perfectly recreated the slow, lagging response. And when they simulated a big upgrade to a wastewater plant, they got that super fast, accelerated cleanup. It proved their theory was right on the money. So what's the big takeaway from all this? It's that there's absolutely no one-size-fits-all solution for cleaning our rivers. A huge, farm-heavy watershed out in the Midwest that's dominated by that legacy nitrogen is going to have a much slower, very different recovery path than a smaller, urban watershed on the East Coast, where you can target one or two specific point sources. And that really brings us to the critical question for the future, right? We now understand that a river has a memory. So the challenge ahead is, how do we manage that memory? How do we set smarter, more realistic goals? And ultimately, how do we find ways to accelerate every river's path back to health?